back and listen to. How about a little bit of your backstory for the audience, just to get a feel for who you are?
All right, absolutely. So my story goes kind of like this. I mean, I graduated from college as a registered nurse. I worked in Boston and then subsequently in Southern California. And I was in Southern California right around the time when the HMOs started rolling out in the hospitals. And it just seemed to me that there was such a disconnect with health and health care. So I started to kind of look, for deeper reasoning behind illness, and of course came upon, holistic medicine, naturopathic medicine. Saw my first naturopath myself around that time, who said, nobody should be eating gluten. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm Italian. So, which is always, the response I get from my patients now, but that's a whole nother podcast. And, so from there, I moved back to the East Coast and started my journey in holistic medicine. So I graduated from the University of Bridgeport with my ND, and then subsequently from Sacred Heart, which is also in Connecticut, with my APRN, because in Connecticut, naturopaths are not allowed to prescribe pharmaceuticals. And on a rare occasion, I find that that's important. I've been in practice about 12 years, and over the last 5 or 6 years, I've really kind of narrowed and honed in on genetics and genetic medicine, particularly among the pediatric population. But as you know, with genetics, genetics come from someplace, like the parents and the grandparents in particular. And research shows us that grandparents' health has a far greater bearing on our children's health than really our health does as their parents. So nowadays I see a lot of pediatric patients, but I also do see their parents and a lot of times their grandparents. And so I spend a lot of time, hyper focusing on genetics. Genetics, as you know, don't define you, but they certainly, can be modulated by the environment in a favorable or unfavorable way. So I think having that information, particularly in a family lineage, can certainly, make you or allow you as a family to make better health choices. And so that's kind of where I've been. I've really been laser focused. And interestingly enough, when I was preparing for this particular podcast, a lot of information research-wise has come out about this COMT mutation, and we're finding, those of us that are really kind of studying it, that it has almost a larger bearing on how our body works as opposed to MTHFR. Of course, clearly they work very closely together. So that's kind of my story.
Well, you demystified MTHFR for me, so I'm thrilled about that. And our title of the chat today is COMT, the Worrier or Worrier. So let's dive. I can barely say that. Worrier or Worrier. So let's dive right in. What is COMT in its base form?
All right. So I did want to just review for your viewers, in case they didn't catch the whole podcast, about a SNP. So SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, which is basically means that there is a genetic variability among our population. So as we talked about the last time with MTHFR, about 60% of the population carries an MTHFR mutation. And why that's important is because if you carry an MTHFR mutation, you're more susceptible to something called oxidative stress. And we worry about oxidative stress because it's basically the catalyst for chronic disease. So moving on to COMT, that mutation works very closely with MTHFR, because MTHFR, as you know, modulates folate and B12 and B6 on some level as well. Well, you need the proper signaling from folate, B6, and B12 to make your COMT enzyme work properly. So COMT stands for catechol O-methyltransferase, which is why we call it COMT, because it's just a whole lot easier to say. And basically, what COMT does is it catalyzes the transfer of a methyl group from SAM, acetyl methionine, to a hydroxyl group. So basically what that means is it's kind of like the guillotine. So it takes a portion of a molecule off and puts it on something else. So the biochemistry for most people is inconsequential and their eyes glaze over. But the way that we can explain it simply is we say it influences dopamine, it influences norepinephrine, and it influences estrogens, right? These are all things that affect all of us as adults. And if these hormones are out of balance, we are in deep trouble. So we know that the genetic variation in our population is about 10%. And those people that are expressing that particular mutation have conditions that are related to anxiety, estrogen-related cancers. They've correlated schizophrenia and neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's also with COMT mutations. So it definitely is something that has a huge bearing on our health. And that's what I see a lot in my practice is I have, parents that come in that say, I have a mother who has Alzheimer's who's in a home, she doesn't even recognize me. And I'm trying to raise two small children and I want to make sure that their fate isn't the same. And so that's when, we start talking a lot about genetics.
Okay, so now you laid down the framework of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, I want to get to what can we do about it. But how do we find out that we have this COMT or one or more of these COMT genetic mutations?
Right. So what I say is, go and see a provider that understands genetics. For me, it's easy to test. It's spit. You can use a cheek swab or you can use saliva and you can test it through any number of companies that are now offering genetic testing. Now, for me, I always err on the side of paranoia. So I always suggest that my patients, use an inexpensive test and just pay for it out of their pocket. So, sometimes these larger companies, these 23andMe or Genocyte or other companies like that, they'll data mine your information. So they'll de-identify you, right? They'll take away your name and your demographics, but they'll send your gene snips to pharmaceutical companies so they can make better drugs. So I always recommend using smaller companies. I use a company out of Wisconsin called Neuroscience that does very, very specific testing. There's another company called Cortigen that's out of the Boston area that also does very targeted testing. Because I think for the most part, getting your whole genome for the vast majority of people is going to be useless information. And so it makes it very easy to kind of hone in and test, just specific things if you're worried about specific concerns.
Okay, so if we use one of these companies, we do a spit test. I did 23andMe years ago, and I know that you can link that to Genetic Genie or Stratagene. Is that the same thing you would do with this Neuroscience or the Cortigene companies? The same kind of concept?
Exactly, except for you don't have to go and re-upload your data like through Stratagene or through Genetic Genie or any of the other companies. Most of it, like through Cortigen, for example, you get a full printout of whether or not you have the gene and whether or not it's expressed right on one piece of paper. So yes, and the other tests like Neuroscience, you don't need an interpretation because you're generally only testing 1, 2, 5, or 10 mutations. So you don't need this huge upload process. All the information is given to you in a one-shot deal.
And how do you spell Cortigene for those who are interested?
Courtagen.
Okay. So then it's simple as that you would go on their site, order their kit, spit in a little tube, send it back, and they send you this, right?
Exactly right. And, Neuroscience, you have the results back in 10 days. Cortigen, depending on the complexity of the panel that you've chosen, can be closer to 2 weeks. But again, it saves you a whole lot of time. When you and I did 23andMe years ago, we had our results back in 3 weeks, but that is not the case these days. Now my patients are waiting 3, sometimes 4 months. So if it's something that you need to know kind of immediately, it definitely is worthwhile to use one of these other companies.
Okay, so then you get the test results. You listen to our first interview on MTHFR. You listen to this one, and then you go and find a practitioner that can help you decipher this material a little bit more. Is that the next step?
Exactly right, because this is, and interestingly enough, so I'm preparing this lecture for you because I like to be prepared and I like I like concise information. So then all over Facebook this weekend, everybody is posting about this mutation, because I'm in that genetic world, so I see this stuff. And all these patients are saying, oh, I was prescribed this, and this by my doctor. I have a COMT mutation and I got sicker. And so that's one of the things that I really wanted to talk about with you and with your client base is that you can't really go to any old practitioner because people that are not educated can certainly push this enzyme in the wrong direction and you will feel worse before you feel better for sure.
Okay, so it affects dopamine, norepinephrine, estrogen. You said it can have neurodegenerative problems, maybe anxieties and things of that nature. What do we do? What do we
All right.
do when we find out we have this?
All right. So, well, let's talk about this first. So there's two types of COMT expression, right? So either you got it or you don't got it, right? And that's why I called this talk the Worrier or the Worrier, right? So if you have two copies of this mutation, that means that your body is not degrading dopamine, epinephrine, or methyl groups. So what that basically means is your body is making appropriate levels of these neurochemicals, and they are sitting in the neurologic synapse, and they are not getting broken down, like kind of like your garbage truck is on strike. So you have a lot of garbage left in these synapses. Well, you'd think, hey, it's dopamine. It's a feel-good hormone. But if you have extra dopamine sitting in your neurosynapse, you're going to be anxious, right? You're going to be revved up. You're going to be the type of person that, is quick-tempered. You're going to have intolerance to foods that other people can eat with ease, like aged cheese or foods that are high in histamine, like bone broth. If you have no copies of this mutation, and your COMT is working normally, you generally have normalized or lower levels of dopamine. You have higher needs of things like B12 and folate, and you have higher needs of things like ginkgo biloba or tyrosine. So the way I describe it to my patients is I describe it as the Worrier or the Worrier, right? So the Worrier is the guy with the excess dopamine, intolerance to methyl groups, and so I usually call that guy the paratrooper, right? Because they're